So, today I want to talk about the Writers Guild strike. The Writers Guild of America began striking on Tuesday in response to failed negotiations with a group known as the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. This group represents a bunch of major studios that you may be familiar with, which include major corporations like Amazon, Apple, Disney, NBC Universal, Netflix, Paramount, Sony, and Warner Brothers. Now, at the core of this strike are issues around how films, television programs, and media as a whole have been utterly transformed in recent years with the advent of streaming services, as streaming has vastly changed the way that writers are paid for their labor. Naturally, these major studios have used the change in format as a loophole to get around paying writers what they're worth. So let's center the voices of these writers today and explore how things have actually changed. The primary way that writers have been compensated historically is through a form of payment known as residuals. If you're not aware of what that is, residuals are a form of compensation that is paid quarterly and provides anyone involved in the production of a show or film a certain percentage of the revenue every time that particular media airs. So, if you happen to be a writer of a specific episode of a show, and that show were to air on network television and that specific episode were to show, you would then receive a portion of the income that was earned from that episode airing. Now, for writers, the majority of this has come from ad revenue. And usually, this money was enough to keep writers relatively financially secure between writing jobs, especially when, for some writers, it can take upwards of a year to 3 years to find more work. So these residuals were able to pay for them in between writing jobs. Now, this percentage of residuals has been negotiated in the industry by different industry trade unions, of which the Writers Guild of America is one. So the Writers Guild helped secure the minimums at the very least for these writers. Now, the trouble is that streaming has completely uprooted this system that was negotiated by the unions, as the entire way that shows are handled and how revenue is generated has drastically shifted and changed with streaming as the new major way that we consume media. Since moving to streaming, the exact same show that aired on network television that was funded by advertising dollars is now being funded through the purchase of subscription services. This change has been, of course, exploited, as I mentioned before, by these major studios in order to avoid paying money to the writers of shows. The shift in pay has been so drastic that writers who would receive residual checks in the thousands of dollar range for their work were now getting paid in the hundreds of dollar range, if not less, after it had been moved to a streaming platform. As an example, we can actually look at one case here where a writer for the show Abbott Elementary, that's on ABC, which was on a traditional network, was being paid $13,500 for a re air, whereas once it went to the streaming service, it went to $700. Others were reporting amounts from going from $25,000 to under $100. And this is pretty consistent, of course, across the board, where these amounts of thousands of dollars per re-airing ended up being dropped down into the hundreds or less dollar range. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that the studios were not still earning record breaking profits during all of this. They just chose not to share the wealth with the writers of the media, since the media was shifted into a new format that the union contract did not account for. Essentially, the studios made this shift away from network television and used it in order to avoid paying these writers. It's pretty explicit what they were trying to do here. Now, in addition to the payments, we also have to address the different ways that shows have been treated upon moving towards streaming, which has affected how jobs have been maintained by these writers. It used to be that a show was designed to hook and engage an audience for an extended period of time. Seasons would last upwards of 20 episodes, and it was not uncommon for a particularly popular show to air for upwards of 10 to 15 seasons. Look at a show like, say, Grey's Anatomy or Supernatural. Now, since the primary motivation for generating profit from the industry was ad revenue, the show had to be designed well and to maintain good ratings, which kept eyes glued to the television at the specific hours that these shows would air. Essentially, these specific shows were considered as individual investments by the companies, and they would require good writers to be on staff to make sure that you stayed watching that show. With the shift over to streaming, however, the primary focus is not making individual shows of high quality, but instead to pump out as many exclusive shows as possible on your streaming platform to get someone to buy into the subscription service model. Now, in this particular model, we've actually seen seasons of shows drop to basically 2 or 3 seasons for really good shows. And each of those seasons are only lasting about 6 to 10 episodes. And there are rare exceptions to this, but that's been the majority of what we've seen. Now, what this has meant is that there are less guarantees for writers to have jobs and be able to maintain them. Previously, shows could have anywhere between 2 to 4 times as many episodes as they do now. And each specific show needed to be crafted with a certain level of care so that advertisers would be able to provide that money because, of course, the show would have high ratings. And again, this incentivized shows to retain writers and pay their writers increased wages than what would be considered the minimums negotiated by the unions. Since the shift to streaming, what we have seen instead is a huge increase in the amount of overall shows produced with far less episodes per show, which of course has meant that some writers have had to try to get work on several different shows in a single season in order to get by. And even worse is that these shows have been hiring newer writers at the minimum union negotiated rate, while using smaller writing staffs, which the industry calls mini rooms. Now, just as an example, we've actually seen a shift where the minimum amount that was paid to certain writers has increased from being a third of the industry to half the industry. So, half of all writers are being paid the union negotiated minimum, where again, previously it was a third of all writers. And that's been a huge drop off in the total amount that has been earned by the Writers Guild. Now, this also isn't even beginning to address that some writers may get basically no compensation at all if a streaming show never actually makes it to the streaming platform, which is actually far more common than you'd think in a model where you're constantly pumping out shows. Essentially, this whole arrangement is designed by the studios in order to make it so that jobs are less secure, that pay has drastically dropped, and the residuals are non existent. In fact, the Writers Guild has actually stated on their website where they were talking about the contract that the company's behavior has created a gig economy inside of a union workforce. Now that's a big problem here. Now the trouble here is that this model is not in any way sustainable. In fact, it's completely self-defeating in a way because without writers there's no media and thus no profit for these companies. And yet, the studio under this model have created the conditions for writers to be unable to put together a career while asking some of them to work in the most expensive cities in the country, like, say, Los Angeles or New York. If writers can't formulate a career and they can't afford the places that they're supposed to live, then how are they supposed to write these shows? And therefore, how are these shows supposed to find writers in order to generate profit for the companies? Yet again, we find a contradiction in capitalism, where it is self defeating when corporations try to operate to maximize profits for their investors. And that's really the primary concern for most of these companies. They've pumped in billions of dollars into these streaming platforms in order for their investors to get a huge return on the entire streaming platform, not individual show success. And because of that, and everything that I've mentioned before, they are beholden to those investors rather than putting out a good product. So, in response to all of this, the Writers Guild has put forward a set of demands to update the union contract to be beneficial for writers under the current reality where streaming has become dominant. Nobody can deny the fact that things have changed. We just need to update it so that we make sure that certain aspects of the industry are changed so that writers continue to receive funding. Now, to be perfectly blunt, the studios have flat out refused to budge from their positions in all of this. Now, the Writers Guild proposal has included things like increased minimums, weekly pay, staffing minimums for shows, guarantees of at least 10 consecutive weeks of work, fixed residuals, plus a new form of residuals based on viewership, which includes a certain amount from foreign viewed shows. So, any subscribers that watch these shows from outside of the US would have a fixed rate in terms of how much they earn. There would be improved pension and health benefits, and stipulations regarding artificial intelligence, which I will address separately in a moment. Now, based on everything that I have shared, and I'll post this in the description so that you can take a look at it yourself, this link. But based on everything that I have shared about how streaming has changed the industry, these changes are common sense and would allow writers to get back to the type of pay they were receiving before. Naturally, however, the studios have flat out rejected most of these proposals, and on many of them have refused to even make a counteroffer, while providing lower increases in terms of the minimum payments that the union wants. In short, the studios like the arrangement that they have created and do not in any way want to pay their writers what they're worth. The fact is that the gap between these proposals is so large that we should expect that the strike is going to last for quite a while. And honestly, it is the studios that really need to be the ones to come to the table ready to negotiate, because nothing that the Writers Guild has been asking for is even remotely outrageous. Now, there is one other factor that I briefly do need to address, and it's something that I mentioned before, and that's the role that artificial intelligence may play in this contract. Now, the Writers Guild is asking for strict limits on AI use in scripts to ensure that studios do not use AI in the coming years to subvert parts of the writing process and to take money away from writers. The fear, of course, is that studios would use AI to generate scripts and only hire writers to rewrite the material that was produced by the artificial intelligence, or, in the opposite situation, that studios would use AI to rewrite material in order to avoid paying writers for rewrites. Now, the Guild also wants material produced by the union to be excluded from training AI models in order to prevent a form of artificial intelligence-based plagiarism where certain writers' styles and or certain materials from writers could end up being reused in scripts generated by artificial intelligence. Now, while I don't think any of us actually know the levels that artificial intelligence will reach in the coming years, I think it's far better that the Writers Guild protect itself and be safer rather than sorry. If the AI ends up becoming a thing and it ends up turning out to be able to do all the types of things that the Guild outlines here, the studios would obviously take every shortcut as they are already doing right now in order to avoid paying writers what they're worth and be able to pump out as much content as possible without having to pay a single person. In addition to all of the other issues that I mentioned before, this attempt to future proof the contract, especially over the next 3 to 6 years, where we'll truly get to see how AI develops, is going to be a highly necessary protection to give the Guild leverage in future negotiations as the technology advances. Especially, again, if the industry takes a massive turn in the near future, just as it did with streaming, something that I don't think anybody in the industry could have truly predicted. And they certainly couldn't have predicted that they would have gone from basically having functional union jobs to essentially gig jobs in these union negotiated contracts. That said, there's something else that I want to point out that I really haven't seen covered. Even if the union wins this contract and manages to avoid the situation that could be created by artificial intelligence and ends up getting all the wages that they want through these residuals, My biggest fear is that in the near future, many of these streaming services will start to switch towards changing the way that they do television and media again, and start to shift towards importing television from outside of the United States, as we saw with shows like Squid Games, in order to cut the Writers Guild out of the equation entirely. Because they are seeing that a lot of shows from outside of the US can work, it would be cheaper for them to pay the licensing fees for those imports than to pay US writers to create unique stories. And I would not put it past these companies again to look at their profit margins as they're doing right now, instead of factoring in that writers need to be able to make a career for themselves as well. And while I am all in favor of including those medias onto streaming platforms, it needs to be considered that a lot of the shows that are produced in the US still need to pay their writers. This isn't entirely unprecedented as a fear either, as the last time that the Writers Guild had gone on strike, network television had begun to be filled with reality TV shows and unscripted television in order to accomplish a similar goal of cutting the writers out of the deals. Now, I do hope that Writers Guild and all of the other unions involved will keep this in mind as they continue to negotiate going forward. Because again, the Writers Guild isn't the only one that's being affected by this sort of thing, even though they're the ones that we're focused on now. And I hope that the Writers Guild are able to keep fighting for and protecting these writers. With that said, though, let's keep solidarity with these writers in their strike and hope that they can get as many of their demands as possible moving forward. And of course, if you learned something here today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord where we have conversations on topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as it goes a long way to helping me to continue to produce content like this, and political content can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.